He thought his power and connections could force her out. But what unfolded in court left his entire scheme exposed, and him scrambling for answers. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. At the defense table sat Mia Johnson, a black single mother in her early 30s, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the past few weeks fighting sleepless nights and endless anxiety over what brought her here today. A fabricated eviction notice from her landlord, Richard Ellis. Across the room, Richard, a Caucasian man in his late 50s, sat smugly beside his attorney. He looked every bit the picture of confidence, certain the court would side with him. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney began, "this case is clear-cut. Ms. Johnson has violated the terms of her lease multiple times. We are seeking a lawful eviction." Mia's heart pounded as the judge nodded, his expression neutral but distant. She glanced at her attorney, Deborah Harris, a seasoned black lawyer in her 40s, with a reputation for taking on systemic injustice. Deborah was unfazed, her sharp eyes scanning the courtroom like she was already 10 steps ahead. "This is more than an eviction," Deborah stated firmly when it was her turn. "It's a pattern, one we're prepared to expose." What Mia didn't know was that Deborah had uncovered something explosive, something that would not only save her home, but also unravel a web of corruption no one saw coming. Have you ever faced someone who thought they could use their power to intimidate you? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that challenge the system. Mia Johnson had spent the past decade building a life for her family in her modest but comfortable rent-controlled apartment. As a single mother of two, she worked tirelessly to provide stability for her 12-year-old daughter, Kayla, and 6-year-old son, Malik. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was home, a place where her children felt safe and where she had found a supportive community. But for her landlord, Richard Ellis, the neighborhood represented an opportunity of a different kind. A wealthy property developer in his late 50s, Richard saw Mia's building as prime real estate. If he could push out long-term tenants like Mia, he could renovate, raise rents, and cash in on the area's rising property values. Over the past year, he had ramped up his efforts, targeting minority tenants with bogus eviction notices and thinly veiled harassment. Mia had ignored the subtle threats at first, the notices accusing her of unpaid rent that she had receipts to prove, the noise complaints filed when her children were asleep. But the final straw came when an official eviction notice arrived, citing fabricated lease violations. Mia knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Desperate and unsure of her rights, she turned to a local tenant advocacy group, where she was connected with Deborah Harris. Deborah, a no-nonsense lawyer with a deep commitment to justice, had seen cases like Mia's too many times. "This isn't just about you, Mia," Deborah said during their first meeting. "It's about every tenant in this building, and every landlord who thinks they can exploit people without consequence." Mia hesitated. She wasn't used to standing up for herself, let alone becoming the face of a fight this big. But when she thought about Kayla and Malik, she knew she had no choice. The court date arrived quickly. Richard, confident in his connections with city officials and the court, believed the case would be a slam dunk. He had retained a well-known attorney with a reputation for intimidating tenants into submission. Mia, meanwhile, entered the courtroom with Deborah by her side, determined but terrified. As the hearing began, Richard's lawyer wasted no time painting Mia as an irresponsible tenant who had repeatedly violated her lease. The judge, a middle-aged Caucasian man with a reputation for siding with landlords, listened intently but did not indicate his thoughts. Deborah, however, sat quietly, her sharp eyes fixed on Richard, She had uncovered something he didn't know she had. A piece of evidence that would turn this case on its head. What would you do in Mia's shoes? Could you take on someone as powerful as Richard Ellis? Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned for the courtroom battle to unfold. The courtroom grew heavier with tension as Richard's lawyer continued his argument, pacing back and forth in front of the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with confidence, Ms. Johnson has repeatedly failed to uphold her end of the lease agreement. Unpaid rent, noise complaints, and unauthorized guests are all documented here. He held up a thick file for dramatic effect, smirking as he passed it to the judge. Mia's stomach churned. Every claim was a lie, but how could she prove it? The judge, flipping through the file, did not indicate his thoughts. Richard sat at his table, arms crossed, watching Mia with a smug expression that made her blood boil. Deborah leaned toward Mia and whispered, "Let him finish. Their arrogance will be their undoing." When it was Deborah's turn to speak, she stood slowly, exuding a calm authority that instantly commanded the room's attention. Your Honor, my client has lived in her apartment for over a decade, paying her rent on time and abiding by her lease. What we're seeing here is not a case of violations, but a landlord attempting to exploit the system to displace long-term tenants. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued but unconvinced. Ms. Harris, accusations of exploitation are serious. Do you have evidence to support these claims? Deborah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted she had been waiting for this moment. I'm glad you asked, Your Honor. She retrieved a folder from her briefcase and walked confidently to the bench. First, Deborah began, holding up a stack of receipts. Here are records of every rent payment my client has made for the past 5 years, including the months Mr. Ellis claims she was delinquent. Each payment corresponds with a bank statement proving they were received and processed. The judge flipped through the receipts, nodding slightly. Richard's smirk began to fade. Second, Deborah continued, the noise complaints cited in the eviction notice were filed on dates when my client was out of town. We have timestamps and photographs proving she and her children were not even in the city on those occasions. A murmur spread through the gallery as Deborah handed over additional evidence. Mia glanced at Richard, whose expression had hardened into a scowl. But Deborah wasn't finished. And finally, she said, her tone sharper now, the eviction notice itself is invalid under the lease agreement. She held up a copy of the lease. Page 12. Section 3 explicitly states that tenants cannot be evicted without a written warning and a 30-day grace period to address any issues. My client received no such warning. The judge's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the document. Mr. Ellis, he said, turning to the landlord, is this accurate? Richard's lawyer stood quickly, his confident demeanor now replaced by nervous energy. Your Honor, I'd need time to review. Deborah cut him off. There's no need. The truth is, Mr. Ellis never intended to follow the lease. This isn't about violations. It's about clearing out a rent-controlled tenant to maximize profits. And we have more evidence to prove this pattern of behavior. The tension in the room reached its peak. The gallery erupted in whispers as the judge leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. Mia felt her heart pounding, but for the first time it wasn't fear, it was hope. What's next for Mia? Has the tide turned? Or is Richard hiding a trump card of his own? Share your thoughts, and stay tuned to see the case take an even more dramatic turn. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Richard Ellis, as the weight of Deborah's evidence settled over the room. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a tense, defiant glare. Even his lawyer, who had projected such bravado earlier, now fumbled through his notes, avoiding the judge's gaze. Deborah, however, wasn't finished. She stepped back to her table and pulled out another file, her voice steady as she addressed the court. Your Honor, the lease agreement invalidates the eviction notice, but this case is bigger than one tenant. It's about a pattern, a system Mr. Ellis has created to target vulnerable tenants, particularly those in rent-controlled units, like Ms. Johnson's. The judge looked up, intrigued. A pattern, Ms. Harris? Do you have evidence to support this claim? Deborah nodded. I do, Your Honor. She held up a stack of documents. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Ellis has issued over 20 eviction notices to tenants in this building. Of those tenants, 80% were minorities, and 90% were in rent-controlled units. Many of these notices cited similar fabricated violations, including noise complaints and unpaid rent that was, in fact, paid. This is not coincidence. It's a calculated effort to push out tenants and raise rents beyond legal limits. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Even the judge's typically stoic expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Furthermore, Deborah continued, we obtained emails from Mr. Ellis's property management team discussing strategies to target tenants based on their perceived ability to fight back. One email even states, and I quote, make it difficult enough, and they'll leave without a fight. The room erupted into gasps, and Richard shot to his feet. That's absurd, he barked, his voice trembling with anger. This is a smear campaign. The judge's gavel came down sharply. Order in the court. Mr. Ellis, you will have your turn to respond. Deborah remained unfazed, her tone measured but resolute. Your Honor, we also have testimonies from former tenants who faced similar harassment and were ultimately forced out. Many of them left under duress, believing they had no legal recourse. Richard's lawyer finally stood, his face flushed. Your Honor, this evidence was not disclosed prior to today. I move to have it dismissed on procedural grounds. Deborah turned to face him, her gaze unyielding. Mr. Ellis had ample time to provide legitimate documentation supporting his claims. Instead, he chose to fabricate evidence and exploit his tenants. Procedural arguments cannot erase the truth. The judge leaned forward, his expression grim. Mr. Ellis, do you have any legitimate explanation for these allegations? Richard faltered, his mouth opening and closing without producing a coherent response. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Deborah returned to her seat, her work done for now. She glanced at Mia, who sat wide-eyed and speechless. This is just the beginning, Deborah whispered. The real fight starts now. What will the judge decide? Is this the start of justice, or does Richard have more tricks up his sleeve? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to see how this case unfolds. The courtroom was electric, buzzing with the fallout of Deborah's revelations. Spectators exchanged murmurs, their expressions a mix of shock and approval. The whispers grew louder as the judge called for a brief recess, his stern demeanor masking the turmoil brewing behind his measured exterior. Mia sat at the defense table, her hands trembling as she looked at Deborah. Do you think it's enough? Will it stop him? Deborah's gaze was steady. We've shaken the foundation, Mia. Now we see how much it cracks. Across the room, Richard Ellis was anything but calm. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his once confident posture slumping under the weight of the evidence presented. For the first time, his lawyer struggled to maintain his composure. Richard's anger was palpable, but so was his fear. Outside the courtroom, Reporters were already gathering, hungry for soundbites. The case had drawn attention beyond the local community, becoming a flashpoint for discussions about housing, discrimination, and tenant rights. A young journalist, recording a live segment on her phone, spoke passionately to her growing audience. This is more than an eviction case. It's a battle against systemic racism and exploitation in housing. If Deborah Harris wins, it could change the game for tenants everywhere. Inside, the judge returned to his chambers, his thoughts racing. The emails Deborah presented were damning, as was the statistical evidence of Richard's targeted evictions. But this wasn't just about facts. It was about precedent. A ruling against Richard could spark lawsuits from other tenants and ripple across the housing industry. For years, landlords like Richard had operated with impunity, their actions shielded by power and connections. Now that shield was cracking, and the judge knew every decision he made would be scrutinized. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Reporters filtered in, cameras poised to capture the moment. The gallery buzzed with energy, as though everyone present sensed they were part of something bigger than themselves. Richard's lawyer rose, his voice firm but strained. Your Honor, while the defense has made compelling arguments, the facts remain that my client is well within his rights to issue an eviction notice. Any discrepancies are unfortunate, but unintentional. Deborah stood to counter, her tone sharp. Unintentional, Your Honor? These patterns aren't accidents. They're deliberate, calculated actions meant to displace tenants like my client for profit. This isn't just a legal issue, it's a moral one. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Ms. Harris, you've presented compelling evidence. But this court's focus is the specific case before us, not the larger systemic issues. Deborah's voice didn't waver. Your Honor, the systemic issues are the case. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a dangerous trend that this court has the power to disrupt. The tension was palpable as the judge called the court back to order. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the next move in this increasingly high-stakes battle. Will the judge stand for justice or protect the status quo? Is Richard's empire about to crumble, or does he have one last trick up his sleeve? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to follow this unfolding drama. As the judge called the courtroom back to order, the weight of Deborah's revelations lingered in the air. The gallery remained abuzz, the spectators exchanging hushed speculations. Mia sat frozen in her seat, her fingers tightly clasped together. The mountain of evidence Deborah had presented felt like a turning point, but she knew Richard Ellis wasn't the type to give up without a fight. Richard leaned toward his lawyer, his whispered words dripping with urgency. His face, once smug, was now a mask of barely controlled fury. Across the room, Deborah's sharp gaze never left him. She knew what men like Richard feared most, accountability. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Ms. Harris, the court recognizes the strength of your argument, but Mr. Ellis has the right to respond. Mr. Peterson, proceed. Richard's lawyer, clearly rattled, but trying to mask it, rose from his seat. Your Honor, while the defense has presented what they call evidence, much of it is circumstantial and speculative at best. My client has acted within the boundaries of the law in every instance, and these claims amount to nothing more than an attempt to tarnish his reputation. Deborah didn't flinch. She waited patiently, letting the lawyer dig himself deeper with every word. This court cannot allow baseless accusations to derail a lawful eviction, the lawyer continued, his voice growing louder. Mr. Ellis is a respected property owner with a proven track record of providing housing to thousands of residents. Suggesting otherwise, without concrete proof, is irresponsible. The judge turned to Deborah, his tone neutral. Ms. Harris, do you have anything further to add? Deborah stood, her movements deliberate. Yes, Your Honor. The evidence I presented today is only the beginning. She walked to her table and pulled out another folder, causing a visible ripple of tension in the room. We recently obtained additional documents through a Freedom of Information Act request. These records show a clear pattern of fabricated eviction notices across multiple properties owned by Mr. Ellis. Furthermore, they include correspondence between Mr. Ellis and city officials, suggesting improper influence in several cases. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Even the judge leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Ms. Harris, he said, you're claiming collusion between Mr. Ellis and public officials? Deborah nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And these documents will make that clear. Richard's lawyer jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. This so-called evidence wasn't disclosed prior to this hearing. I move to have it dismissed immediately. Deborah remained calm. Your Honor, this evidence is newly obtained and directly relevant to the case. Given the gravity of the claims, I request that it be admitted for review. The judge hesitated, then nodded. Submit the evidence. This court will review it. As the documents were handed over, Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the look of a man cornered. Mia turned to Deborah, her voice a whisper. Do you think this will be enough? Deborah's eyes stayed fixed on Richard. It's more than enough. But this fight isn't over yet. What will the new evidence reveal? Will it expose a deeper conspiracy? Or will Richard find a way to wriggle free? Stay tuned as the case takes another dramatic turn. The courtroom was quieter now, the tension a simmering undercurrent as the judge reviewed the new evidence. Every glance toward the bench carried a mix of expectation and anxiety. Mia could feel her pulse in her ears, her hope battling against years of living in a system where justice felt like a distant dream. Deborah remained composed, her sharp eyes never leaving Richard Ellis. She knew this wasn't just about exposing his actions. It was about dismantling the culture of impunity that allowed landlords like him to thrive. The judge finally looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and something resembling anger. Ms. Harris, he said, his tone heavy, these documents allege a pattern of targeted evictions and possible collusion with public officials. This is a serious claim. Do you have corroborating evidence to support these allegations? Deborah nodded, her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. Included in the documents are names and contact details of former tenants who have agreed to testify. Their stories align with the pattern we've presented today. Furthermore, we have communications between Mr. Ellis and a city housing inspector discussing strategies to circumvent rent control protections. The gallery erupted into whispers, and even the reporters present leaned forward in their seats. The judge rapped his gavel for silence, his expression growing darker as he turned to Richard's lawyer. Mr. Peterson, the judge said sharply, how does your client respond to these allegations? Richard's lawyer stood, visibly struggling to maintain composure. Your Honor, these documents are unverified, and the testimonies mentioned are hearsay. My client denies any wrongdoing and maintains that this eviction is a lawful exercise of his rights as a property owner. Richard, however, wasn't content to let his lawyer speak for him. He stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is a witch hunt," he bellowed. "I've done nothing wrong. These accusations are baseless and meant to tarnish my reputation. I won't stand for it." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Ellis, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Richard hesitated, his fury barely contained, but he returned to his seat. The judge turned back to Deborah. "Ms. Harris, the court will need time to evaluate this evidence. However, the claims presented today raise significant concerns. If these allegations are substantiated, they may warrant further legal action beyond this eviction case." Mia exhaled slowly, her grip on the edge of the table loosening slightly. Deborah turned to her, a small, reassuring smile playing on her lips. "This isn't the end," Deborah whispered. "It's the beginning of something much bigger." As the judge called for another recess, the gallery buzzed with speculation. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, eager for statements. Mia and Deborah walked past them silently, the weight of the moment sinking in. But deep down, Mia felt a spark of hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that justice might prevail, not just for her, but for every tenant who had faced what she endured. How far does Richard's corruption go? Will this case spark the systemic change Deborah hopes for? Let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe to follow the next episode of this fight for justice. As the courtroom emptied once again for the recess, the tension didn't dissipate. It only grew. Spectators lingered outside, their conversations buzzing with speculation. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones in hand, trying to get statements from anyone involved. The case had officially transcended Mia Johnson's personal fight. It had become a symbol of the larger battle against systemic racism and exploitation in housing. Inside the courthouse, Mia sat quietly on a bench, her hands clasped tightly together. Her children, Kayla and Malik, sat beside her, their small hands reaching for hers. Kayla leaned in and whispered, "Mom, is it over?" Mia shook her head, forcing a smile for her daughter's sake. "Not yet, sweetheart. But we're getting closer." Deborah joined them, her expression serious but calm. She handed Mia a water bottle and sat down beside her. "This isn't just about this case anymore," Deborah said quietly. "The documents we presented today could spark an investigation into the city's entire housing system. That's why Ellis is panicking. He knows this fight is far from over." Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the courthouse, Richard Ellis was pacing furiously. His lawyer stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones. "We need to contain this now," Richard snapped. "If those documents hold up, they'll come for all of us." "We still have options," his lawyer replied. "But if this goes public, you won't just lose this case. You could lose everything." Richard stopped pacing, his expression darkening. "Then make sure it doesn't go public." Back in the courtroom, Deborah sat at the defense table, her focus unshaken. She reviewed her notes, preparing for the next round. But something nagged at her. The feeling that Richard wasn't done fighting, that he had more tricks up his sleeve. Just as the judge re-entered the courtroom, a court clerk handed Deborah an envelope. Her brow furrowed as she opened it. Inside was a brief note, typed in bold letters. "This isn't your fight. Walk away or face the consequences." Deborah's jaw tightened as she folded the paper and slipped it into her briefcase. She turned to Mia, her voice low. "Stay focused. They're trying to scare us, but we got the truth on our side." As the judge prepared to resume the hearing, the gallery fell silent once more. Outside, the growing media frenzy hinted at the case's far-reaching implications. How far will Richard go to protect his empire? What secrets lie behind the threats against Deborah? And will Mia finally find the justice she deserves? Let us know if you want to see the next episode of this gripping story. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss what happens next.